Here's a look at the Beatles in Mono vinyl box set. This came out in 2014, 5 years after the CD reissues of the albums in mono, and this was a very well done set. My other post on the Rolling Stones box set, I think I gave it a strong A- for the Rolling Stones. This set is going to get a higher rating. I will tell you that right now. So to start things off, it comes in this sort of slip case that slips right off and reveals the box. Very nice touch. Unsliced apple on the outside, sliced apple on the inside. On the back there's sort of a blurb advertising type thing. The Stones set had this one too. I don't know if I showed it or not, but theirs was just a slick. It wasn't a sleeve like this, and this was just in the shrink wrapping on the back. I don't think that I showed that on the Stones box set. And unlike the Stones box set, oh, that was the back. That's why they had the unsliced apple. This is the front. Unlike the Stones box set, this is a little bit heavier, and it flips open like that. It's got foam inside to protect everything. This, that's mine, I put in there for storage. Comes with a nice hardcover book, a lot thicker than the Stones book, if you'll notice that. And there's some great photos in here, recording information and all that on every album. A lot of this looks like it was put together by Kevin Howlett, probably from Mark Lewison's information, who wrote the great recording sessions book and many others on the Beatles. So you know that's going to be excellent stuff. The essays in the Stones box are more essays, whereas this is more of a textbook almost. Both well done though, and from great authors. So that's what's in here. I'll show you some of these things that are peeking out a little bit later. And so I'll put that there. It's very heavily done. And to get right to it, you know, we all know the music, so I'm going to concentrate more on the British versus American, mono, stereo, that sort of thing, the packaging of this set, all that good stuff. So the first album in here, I'm going to go in order, is Please Please Me. This came out in early '63 in England. And you'll notice they faithfully recreate. The colors look great, the photography, clearly, unlike the Stones, sadly for the Stones, the Beatles and their organization saved all the original artwork, I'm pretty sure, or EMI did, because they were much more organized, EMI was. The Stones were sort of operating as an independent entity, leasing their stuff back to Decca. Whereas the Beatles were firmly with EMI, recorded in their one studio almost exclusively, and all that. On the back, you'll see they did the fold-over or tip-on, whatever you call it, type sleeves. They've recreated all the logos and everything because they had the rights for this. On the Decca set for the Stones, they did not have the rights for the FFRR logo, if you'll remember. The only thing about this that I don't like, and it's more for the set than this particular package, if you'll notice this here, and the Stones set has this too, these are the, see that? They're sticky. There's a sticky strip there that keeps them closed. I really dislike those. The Stones jackets were nice, laminated, so it wasn't as big deal. Some of the Beatles ones, the back cover is unlaminated cardstock, and that could catch on that when you're trying to get an outer tear. So I'll show you my solution for that. What I did, I always like to store albums where you put the jacket in. Here, I'll just show you. There's one here. Oh, okay, so this is, I store albums like this. I put the jacket in, a sleeve facing upright from the fold, and then I put the discs in on the back so that they're not crunching up against the jacket and making ring wear. And you'll see after 25 years, Sir Mix-a-Lot is beautiful. And I put the discs in like that. So that's what I decided to do for these. And so what I've done is, I had to do it a little bit differently though because of that ridiculous sticky strip. I've taken these, like so, I put them in like this. Wait, is that what, that's not what I did. I put them in like this. And then put them in like that. And then I've been putting the disc itself in like that. See that? So the disc opening is facing up, the sleeve opening is facing out, and then when you put them in and out, it's not a problem. Looks great. And you'll see, getting back to the box set, nice original parlor. Only very few were made like with this label, mono or stereo. The stereo didn't come out for a few weeks, I believe, after the original mono, because mono, as we've discussed, was the preferred format back then. That's the whole reason for this box set. The mono mixes of the Beatles albums were unavailable for many years for most of their work. But that's really the way that they preferred to hear it and the way that they concentrated the most when they were mixing down their albums back in the 60s through, really through late 68, through the White Album. After that, stereo came in pretty rapidly and they concentrated only on that. We'll get to that at the end of this video. But they did a good job with this. This album, by the way, this British album, came out in early 63. In America, in mid-63, this was supposed to come out on a small Chicago R&B label called Vee-Jay Records. They had the Four Seasons, they had Jerry Butler, the Impressions, they had Jimmy Reed, the blues singer. All those folks were in the Rock Hall, by the way. That's my Chicago pride. So Vee-Jay was supposed to release a version of this album in mid-63, but they put out 2 singles from this, or 1 single, I think Love Me Do, and then they put out a single, For Me to You. They didn't do anything really over there, so they shelved the album because the label was having money problems. It was all set to go, they had the artwork done, everything, but then they shelved it because their label was having money problems. One of the top guys was actually using profits to cover his gambling losses, so it didn't come out in July of 63. Fast forward 6 months, they found out that Capitol was going to be doing a big push for the Beatles. They quickly rushed their album out into release called Introducing the Beatles. And there's a whole, I'm not going to go into, there's a whole video unto itself of the legal aspects of whether they could do that and why they couldn't, and the lawsuits for Capitol, and there was injunctions, and they repackaged the material, changing the track listings, all that sort of thing. But Vee-Jay, for about 10 months there, was able to press Introducing the Beatles in various forms. I have several copies from my time in Chicago, and that's another post unto itself because there were so many counterfeits and bootlegs of that over the years. But this album has 14 songs, 8 originals and 6 covers. Of those 14, 11 ended up on this. This is the American version of Introducing the Beatles. Introducing the Beatles came out early 64. This came out early 65 to replace that because Introducing the Beatles was no longer a thing. Vee-Jay had to delete it after all the legal issues. So this includes, this is the American, this includes 14, or 11 of these 14 songs. The songs left off of here are I Saw Her Standing There, which went on to Meet the Beatles, and then Misery and There's a Place, which were put out in a single briefly and didn't do anything when this came out. And I guess they figured they'd put them on an album later, and they wouldn't get to for many years. So 11 of the 14 right here, and it even says, it's got a blurb, since this came out in 65, 11 of their 1964 American hit recordings. This is a stereo version from the late 80s that we had gotten. It's in beautiful shape, so I've played it only a few times, and this, it's in a clear inner sleeve, by the way, it's not just in there. And this is drenched in reverb compared to this. Very annoying. So that's the first Beatles album. After that came With the Beatles. We all know this cover, one of the most famous in music. It's been alluded to, I don't want to say parodied, many times. That's the Parlophone mono label that would be with the group for almost its entire existence. And most copies of Please Please Me in Britain probably ended up with that label instead of the black and gold we saw. This is, again, 8 originals and 6 covers. It starts with It Won't Be Long, which they hoped would be a nice kickoff the way I Saw Her Standing There would. And it ends with Money, the Motown tune, Berry Gordy, which they hoped it would be like Twist and Shout, a mind-blowing ending to the album. In this case, this album was really what's called a cover album back then. Not an album of songs by other people, but an album put out to cover, quote-unquote, the 2 singles. They had put out Love Me Do, which went to 17 in England, Please Please Me, which went to number 1 or 2, depending on who you ask. So those 2 singles did pretty well. They figured, okay, we'll put out a whole album. That's even why they advertised with Please Please Me and Love Me Do and 12 other songs. So they put this album out as part of that. The other 10 songs on this disc were recorded in one day-long session. They recorded all of them. When they got to Twist and Shout, John destroyed his throat, which is why it's so amazing. They tried a second take, actually, and that wouldn't fly at all. And so the first take came out. It's one of the greatest performances in rock music. I think everyone can agree on that. After this, during the sessions for this, they also recorded Hold Me Tight, which they would eventually give, I think, to Helen Shapiro. They didn't like their recording of that for Please Please Me, so they tried it again for this album, and it worked out great on this album. This came out the day John F. Kennedy was killed, November 22nd, 1963, in England. It came out in America as Meet the Beatles, and we've all seen that. That one's got a bit more of a blue tint to the photo. It's got the big banner here, Meet the Beatles, as we've all seen. And of these 14 songs on here, they included, what would that be? 9. They included all 8 originals from this album, plus Till There Was You, which is from The Music Man. That's a song Paul selected to sort of show their the breadth and depth of their influences, and Capitol probably figured, oh, we'll put that on there. The Music Man is non-threatening to parents, so they'll be fine with it. Instead of, there's also 5 songs on here that are R&B covers. None of those made that on to Meet the Beatles. So 8 originals, and Till There Was You came from this, To Meet the Beatles. They also included I Want to Hold Your Hand and This Boy, which had been on a single here in America and in England. And I Saw Her Standing There, which we mentioned earlier, from Please Please Me. The other 5 songs, the R&B covers, they were combined with a few other songs like She Loves You, and that came out as the Beatles' second album, and that is phenomenal to listen to just because it's so heavy. It's probably their rockingest album. A lot of people say, oh, it's much better because it doesn't have Paul's sappiness. Well, at the same time, sometimes you needed that, not sappiness, but you needed to be well-rounded. But if you just want a straight-ahead rock and roll album, the Beatles' second album is probably your best bet. Next, the Beatles actually released, before this, they released an EP called Long Tall Sally with 4 songs, 3 covers and 1 original. And at the same time then, shortly after, they released this, the soundtrack for their first film. This is 13 songs by the group, all written by John and Paul, which was a big achievement back then. And as you can see, this has again got the parlophone, it's got the tip-on, so all of the albums, these early albums, are pretty much going to adhere to this format. Of this album, this was broken up in America onto 2 albums. There was a whole legal thing with this. The film, Hard Day's Night, was released by United Artists Pictures. So United Artists insisted, we get to put out the soundtrack album. So you'll see, it's on United Artists. And they picked 4 of the photos there to put on here. There's Paul, John, George, Ringo. Let's see if we can find them. Let's see if it's a concentrated block of 4 or not. You know what? Since they're so cropped, I can't even tell. Songs from this that were in the movie, 7 songs from the movie were on side 1 of this. Those 7 songs are on here, along with a bunch of instrumentals by George Martin Orchestra that are kind of superfluous. The songs also came out on Capitol, mostly on this album. And the deal was that they could put out an album with those songs, they just couldn't name it A Hard Day's Night, because then it would compete with this. And sure enough, this went to number 1, and this got stuck behind it at number 2. So United Artists clearly negotiated a pretty good deal. There's the 7 songs on side 1 of this from the film. There's 6 songs on side 2 that were not in the film. And oddly enough, it's 13 songs, as I mentioned earlier. Every one of the Beatles albums through Revolver, 14 songs. They even made a point with Rubber Soul in one of Mark Lewison's books to say that 13 songs just wasn't done. You had to have 14 for balance. So I'm always mystified why this only had 13. They could have included I Call Your Name, which was on the Long Tall Sally EP, which was an original. They could have included You Know What to Do, which was a George song, which he demoed around this time and was lost for many years. They didn't find it again until the anthology. It's not even mentioned in Mark Lewison's recording sessions book. This came out in the late 80s, and it's been revised and repackaged and renamed several times. But this is just, and they add in information about concerts and places that the band went, and they go earlier than the recording sessions. But if you just want to know their core recordings, how they were made and recorded and released at EMI 62 to 70, Love Me Do to Let It Be, this is the book. This is a phenomenal read. But in here they note that for Rubber Soul, which we'll mention in a minute, that 13 songs just wasn't done. So You Know What to Do, the George song I mentioned earlier that's on Anthology, not mentioned in here because the tape was lost. They could have included that. They could have included One After 909, which they had recorded in 63, then they abandoned it, brought it back during the Let It Be sessions. So I've never understood why this only had 13 songs on it. But obviously, it was another number 1 album, so they weren't hurting too badly for tunes. One thing on here, on the American version of this, I'll note, this says stereo. The songs were in mono. They were sent over in mono mixes, and United Artists just put them on here in mono, or in this case, rechanneled stereo. The instrumental tracks from George Martin are in true stereo. So that's interesting. But on the back, this whole release was always a mess. They rushed it into production, and they did little things that didn't quite make sense. Like, for example, released through Alan Owen, screenplay by United Artists. I don't think so. The screenplay was by Alan Owen. It was released through United Artists. Many copies call this Tell Me Why. They say Tell Me Who. It's misprinted. And in fact, on this copy, it's correct on the jacket, but it's incorrect on the label. Right there. Tell Me Who. You tell me who. So this tan label, by the way, is from the late 60s, early 70s. The original copies would have had a black United Artists label. And if you're marveling at the condition of this, this is my father's. My father took meticulous care of his records, and you'll notice as I pull a lot of them up, they're still in the shrink wrap and everything like that. This one wasn't from him. That's why it's a little beat up. So props to my dad, who's also a huge Beatles fan and a great person. Next album, Beatles for Sale. This came out in late 64. This was recorded, get this, the band was on tour at the time. They had to come up with a new album. They had to come up with a new single. In England, singles were kept separate from albums. They had to do a stage show, which they did every Christmas, 63, 64, 65, I think, where it was them and the Yardbirds, and they did plays and sketches, and there was other singers. There was a whole extravaganza, variety show extravaganza every night. This was all close to Christmas, late in the year. And then they had to prepare this album all in the middle of that. So this, once again, goes back to the 8 originals, 6 covers formula. They look pretty tired on the front jacket. I used to have a Dutch original copy of this, and I'm pretty sure that this is a little bit grainier, this photograph, than that. Just a hair. So there's only so much you can do with that. But it still looks fantastic. It's got the correct label, and it's got, you recognize that? Do you have a long memory, or even a short one? Huh. There it is. So that's where they got that photo. They just cropped it. A lot grainier on here than it is on that. This was also the first Beatles album to have, oh, see, this is why I don't like these jackets at all. This was the first one. You'll notice there's no song titles in the back or sleeve notes. See, every other album, Beatles album before this, the 3 before, it was arranged like that. There was the song list and liner notes, usually written by Tony Barrow, their one of their press officers. This one did not have that. Had a photo, and oh, look at that! It's a fold-open gatefold, and the disc would go in there. This was called a unipack back then, where it opened from the center, or opened in a gatefold, but it went in there instead of here. This is called I think Unipack was the company, UNIPAK. And typically when I see those, you'll see right in here listed the word Unipack. One thing I did not mention earlier, every album comes with a brochure, sort of a certificate advertising the Beatles' love, which parts of that album aren't bad. But this has got information and track information and all that good stuff, how the mastering was done. So this whole set was done from the original mono analog tapes, master tapes, which have really not been touched since the mid-60s. The Beatles compact discs in 1987, the stereo CDs that just came out, those were all done. They copied the analog tapes, stereo tapes, to digital, and then transferred them. Here, they went right from the analog mono tapes to this, and I think that's one of the reasons this sounds phenomenal. Every one of these sounds absolutely stunning. Every release in this box set, and that's the reason why. As far as the music on this album, by the way, this is not one of their. It's not their top effort. I mean, to be the worst Beatles album, this is still better than 99% of what's out there. It's got 8 Days a Week on it. It's got Honey Don't. Most people know that. Every Little Thing, which was covered by Yes on their first album to great dramatic effect. And then Everybody's Trying to Be My Baby, George's swinging take on that. No Reply, a lot of people know. Rock and Roll Music, Kansas City, Hey, Hey, Hey. So a lot of memorable stuff on here, but they just sound a little bit tired. And in Mark Lewison's book, they've mentioned that because they were exhausted from doing all this. The only song on this that I don't care for, that I absolutely hate, that I wish they'd never recorded or released, that should not have been committed to tape or unleashed on mankind, is the second to last song on side 1, Mr. Moonlight. It is a dreary, horrible, organ-laden, disgusting mess. And the original was not bad. It's an R&B cover, but I just hate that song. If you pull Beatles Anthology 1 out, they recorded Leave My Kitten Alone, another R&B song. They should have included that. That would have been much better on here than Mr. Moonlight. When Rolling Stone magazine redid their list of the 500 greatest Beatles, or 500 greatest albums of all time, they included every original Beatles album except Magical Mystery Tour, Yellow Submarine, which is not really an album, and this. So, and Magical Mystery Tour is a double EP expanded to an album. We'll talk about that in a minute. This was the only real album of the Beatles that they didn't include. So that should tell you something. I still think it's all the fault of that Mr. Moonlight. But most of the songs from this ended up either on Beatles 65, which came out in 64 just like this, and led to a whole slew of imitators. Suddenly everybody's putting out an album that's, Sinatra 65 or Sergio Mendes in Brazil, 65. But this Beatles 65, some of the songs went on there, and some of the songs went on here, Beatles 6. So this came out right after the early Beatles. This was their second album to come out in America, second or third, in 1965. So that's what happened with those. So the next Beatles album now is Help. This came out in early 65, the soundtrack for their second film, the first film in color, and they're spelling out in semaphore, N-U-J-V. I'm not sure why that is. And this is the American version. You'll notice they really pepped up the cover for that. You'll also notice they rearranged the group. They moved Ringo from fourth to second. So now that I'm looking at it, I don't know semaphore. I don't know which one's N-U-J-V. I think it's this one. Someone out there knows semaphore, which is when you use flags and motions like this to communicate. Someone leave a comment. Tell me which of these is N-U-J-V. I'm going to go with this one. This is a much classier, simpler cover, I'd have to say. I very much more enjoy it. This, once again, has the 7 songs from side 1 of this. 7 songs from side 1 on this are from the soundtrack. They made it onto here in America. Then they added in a bunch of instrumentals again from the George Martin Orchestra. This is all stereo, true stereo, unlike the Hard Day's Night one. And this also includes, it's unfortunate they didn't include this, and you won't really be able to see it because, again, my father kept his shrink wrap on here. But if you peek in there, this is gatefold. This is a gatefold album. And so the gatefold, all the pictures and interestingness and that did not make it over to, or were not imported from England because they didn't have them in England. So the British pressing, once again, the Parlophone label, they've gone back from the Unipack to this, a little bit different, no sleeve note, just some photos. And unlike the formula from before, 8 originals and 6 covers, this one's got 7 originals and 3 covers. And the 3 covers are all on side 2. So, I'm sorry, 2 covers. I miscounted. That's even better. George gets in a couple songs, so that's nice for him. He usually would get 1 at most. This also includes Yesterday, which was not released as a single in England, but it was here, and it went gangbusters. The songs from this album that weren't on the Help soundtrack album ended up, as you'll see in a moment, some of them on Beatles 6, which we talked about earlier, and some of them on Yesterday and Today. And a lot of people don't realize the title, the reason it's called that is Yesterday, the song, and Today. We'll talk about this in a minute, but I wanted to point that out. So the next Beatles album was Rubber Soul. This, again, they had to record this in a rush at the end of the year. They had craziness going on, but they managed to make one of their best albums. And by this point, I think some substances were really starting to influence them in their creativity. And so it's a great album. I don't need to tell you that. This is one of their greatest albums. And this begins the run of this right through Abbey Road of phenomenally forward-moving albums that were all each very different and excellent. So Rubber Soul, there's a lot to say about this. I mentioned earlier the 14-song rule, quote-unquote. Well, this, when they were finished, they were exhausted. They were trying their best to get this album done so it could get out in time for Christmas. They only had 13 songs. So they added one. They went back and they found a song called Wait, which had been recorded for Help. They added some percussion, some pedal steel guitar, and did the vocals, and then that became the 14th song on this album. And they were done, which worked out great for them. This was another album that was all originals. There was no covers. George got 3 songs on this album, and the rest were by Lennon and McCartney. Was it 3 or was it 2? Well, George got at least 2 songs on here. Let's go with that. My memory's fading me. And they've got the photographs, which look excellent. The Parlophone label, as I said, and this sounds phenomenal, this new reissue. In America, as you'll see, almost the same back cover. They pretty much retained everything. They sort of shifted it down to put this up here instead of down there. But that's about it. And the songs, though, in here, they had to rearrange this because they didn't use, on this Rubber Soul, all of these. There's 14 songs here again, as I mentioned. All of these did not make it over here. It was only 9 songs made it over here from the 14. And they added 2 from Help, from before, from the British Help. So this is, I know it gets very confusing, but that's what happened here. Some of these songs made it over to this. As far as the jackets themselves, they look pretty good, but you'll notice this one has more of a brown tint. I've seen some that are sort of olive as opposed to this brown, but it's quite a bit different. The band themselves, though, they just look a little bit darker. I guess that would be browner on this American. This is an original American stereo pressing, hence the full dimensional stereo. So the cover was pretty well done on this. This is what British covers originally look like. I've seen some that have a bit lighter of an orange, but overall, that's what it looked like. And as far as the title itself, the way that they got that was during one of the sessions, you can hear Paul saying Plastic Soul on the session tape. And what he's referring to is a lot of black musicians referred to Mick Jagger as Plastic Soul Man, I suppose. I don't know that it was an insult so much, but that's what they referred to him, and then it evolved into Rubber Soul, and the Beatles got an excellent title for their sixth album. This also includes Nowhere Man, which was released as a single in America, went to number 3 in early '66. But there's, from the session tape of Nowhere Man, when they were getting ready and they were trying to get their harmonizing in check, they were warming up. A snippet of that is played in the Yellow Submarine film, so you can listen for that right before the Nowhere Man song plays in that movie. That's they didn't do that for the movie. That was actually from a session tape. Moving ahead, Revolver, great album. I mean, every one of these is great. I don't need to keep saying that, I suppose. Revolver came out in mid-'66 in England and had this great cover by Klaus Voormann, who would go on to play bass on John, George, and Ringo's solo efforts all throughout the '70s. He was a good friend of theirs, and he's still around. And he obviously played a mean bass. They had met him in Germany when they used to go to Hamburg. Well, this is Revolver, and it came out in mid-'66. Once again, we have that excellency. Once again, we have that. Oh, my copy, look at that. I didn't notice that was like that when I first got it. So that's the back cover in England, and in America, back cover was pretty much identical. No tip-on, of course, or fold-over sleeve. But other than that, they retained it, which was nice. This album, by the way, the front cover, you'll notice, they've got the Capitol logo here, and the Parlophone logo there. That's a nice touch. It also doesn't have the Beatles name on it. It doesn't say the Beatles anywhere. Neither did Rubber Soul. That was the first one not to have their name on it. But this, the only difference, big difference between the two, this is going to lead us down a scary path. You'll see 14 songs, all originals, mostly by John and Paul, some by George. Here, 11 songs. 11 songs was the norm in America. So where are those 3 songs from here, the British copy, that aren't on the American? Okay, here we go. This may take a minute. Bear with me. This album came out, Revolver, in England and America, August of '66. They were on tour, what turned out to be their final tour. Earlier in the year, in June, we got this, Yesterday and Today. I talked about this a minute ago with Yesterday and Today. This contains songs going all the way back to Help. Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver. All the stray songs from those ended up on here. From the British copies that weren't on the American versions, ended up on this. The original covers of this is a very famous story, had the Beatles in bloody smocks with doll parts all around them. And that was their way of protesting what they saw as the butchering of their British albums, because the songs were all moved around. The story I've heard is that they picked up an American copy of Help, and that's what was the final straw, seeing how that had been butchered. So they put that cover together for Yesterday and Today, and it went out, and it almost immediately got complaints and came back. And you'll notice that Ringo's dark sweater, you see his dark V sweater, that you can see that darkness? Okay, keep that in mind. So what happened was, the copies were sent back very quickly, and they pasted over them with this cover. It didn't have this gold record award. This is a later pressing. But this was pasted over them quickly. It's called a paste over. And the album was sent back out. So there are copies out there. I bet by now most of them have been found. But there are copies out there that under this is that butcher cover. And the way to tell a lot of times is you can see Ringo's V sweater thing sort of peeking out from the white. Those are pretty valuable. The ones with the cover still intact, the butcher cover still intact, are really valuable, as you can imagine. And it's called the butcher cover. It's a well-known collectible. It's one of the most collectible albums in music, especially stereo copies. There's very few of them out there. Now, for the last 3 or 4 years, though, I've been seeing online, a lot of people have taken to making butcher copy albums, their own, I guess reproductions, and they'll include a disc inside that's got red vinyl. So that's a nice touch. It's a nice little collectible. It's 20, 30 bucks instead of several thousand, and makes people happy because you're never going to find an actual butcher cover a lot of times. So this is actually, as you saw, an Apple pressing from the late 60s, early 70s. This was my father's, again, the shrink wrap. By then it had gotten a gold record award. They would stamp that on there. And that's what's happening with Yesterday and Today, which took the 3 errant songs from Revolt. They actually, Capitol said, we need 3 more songs for our new album for the summer. What do you got? And EMI and George Martin said, well, we have 3 songs on here that you can have that are, you know, that are coming for a new album. We'll just send them over. So they sent over Dr. Robert, I'm Only Sleeping, and Your Bird Can Sing. And those mixes are all slightly different than what ended up on the final album, mono and stereo. So that means that there's, what would that be? 1, 2, 3, 4 versions at least of each of those songs out there. And I've linked to a Columbia University database of all these crazy changes below this, so you can find out what you need to find out by going over there and looking it up. There's also another errant mix from this album, very difficult to find. The first day or two that this was out in England, on mono copies, they put the wrong mix of Tomorrow Never Knows. Tomorrow Never Knows was very difficult to mix, as you can imagine from listening to it, because they had the whole track with drums and guitar and vocal and everything, and then the effects, the tape loops, Paul was literally sitting there with a mixing board and turning them up and down at whim, almost like he was playing it like it was an instrument, like a mellotron or a keyboard today in modern parlance. And so he turned this one up and it would be the sound of birds chirping. He turned this one up and it would be the sound of glasses breaking or something. I can't remember all the effects. And so every mix was slightly different. Well, there was one mix, and it runs a little bit longer. It fades out a little bit slower, and the vocal's louder. That mix was on first pressings of this for the first day or so in England, mono copies only. They quickly brought it back in and put it back out with the correct mix. So those are phenomenally rare and expensive. Actually, I don't know if they're that phenomenally expensive. I feel like I've seen them online and they're not too terribly expensive. You can find the mix online too. And it's not on this box set. It's never been released anywhere else, which is unfortunate. But that's just one anomaly to this set, that's not here. I mean, they didn't want that mix out originally, so this is supposed to be the vision of what the Beatles released in '66 on purpose, not by accident. So that's probably a good reason for them not to have included that mix on this box set. Moving ahead, the Beatles' next album was almost a year before it came out, was, of course, Sgt. Pepper. Not a lot to say about this album. The packaging was very lavish for the time. It's got the Parlophone again. The mix is quite different in spots from the stereo version that we've all come to know and love. And it's got all this fun stuff, and it's got what I believe is the first clue to the Paul is Dead mystery, if you subscribe to that. George's thumb is pointing at 5 o'clock, Wednesday morning at 5 o'clock, which is supposedly when the car accident that killed Paul in 1966 happened. Anyhow, not to be morbid. This is a well-done package for this set. The label looked great. It sounds excellent in mono, and it even comes with the sheet of cutouts, which was included with originals, which is right there. I do not, however, believe, or no, it did. It comes with that. It also comes with, I'll show you, this inner sleeve, an extra inner sleeve, designed for them by the Dutch group The Fool. If you're American, you've seen this, but it's straight edges. In Britain, it was tapered like that. And this was the first album to have the same tracks on it, both in England and in America. In late '66, the band signed a new deal with EMI, a new record deal, and that was one of the stipulations. So this album was recorded starting in late '66. First they recorded Penny Lane, and Strawberry Fields, and When I'm 64. Maybe not quite in that order. Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane were newer songs, that harkened back to places John and Paul remembered growing up. When I'm 64 was, of course, A Young Man Looking Forward, and it was a song they used to play when their amps broke down in the early days, before they were famous, back at the Cavern Club. So 3 songs with a very nostalgic bent, and a lot of people have said that at that point the album was probably going to be about childhood. The group had given up touring, they'd taken a big break at the beginning of '66, and then they were taking a big break here at the end of '66. So they were really finally getting a chance to sort of get into their own heads, and the album was probably going to be about childhood. But the record companies needed a single. So in early '67, they took Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane for a single, and that was sort of the end of the childhood angle, and then this album became this. Eventually, Paul came up with this concept of a fake band and the album that goes on tour for you, and this was born, and which is fine. They're both good things. I guess it all worked out. We'll never know what the childhood album would have been, but that's what happens. There's the awesome gatefold that they reproduced. So they did a really good job with this package and with the music. One thing I will say, this was released in 2014. A couple years before this, they put out a box set of the stereo albums, which received very mixed reviews. A lot of it did not sound great, but the one that stood out for most people was the stereo Sgt. Pepper, and you'll notice that the cover looks identical except for this sticker on the shrink wrap. But this, they cleaned it up so much. It's almost, to some people, it might actually be too much. But this sounds really excellent, this stereo version. So it's one of the few that I recommend you buy both. It's really worth having. And getting back to the Fool for a second, should have mentioned, this was a collective of artists. They also did the sleeve, a lot of the work for the Rolling Stone Satanic Majesties. You can probably start to recognize the motif now, if you know that cover for Satanic Majesties. And they also did a mural for the Beatles Apple Records store, which opened in '68. And I don't know if you can see it in this film, but in the movie Hot Millions, which is Bob Newhart, Maggie Smith, Peter Ustinov, Carl Malden, it takes place in London. There's a scene where Maggie Smith and Bob Newhart are out for the day shopping. And it's a pretty good movie, slow in spots, but pretty good. And they go into the Apple Records boutique, and it's probably our only film of the inside of that, because it was open for a brief time. So there's a few minutes in there of them browsing in the Apple Records boutique with a lot of stuff probably that came from the Fool who made said Inner Sleep, at least. There's Magical Mystery Tour. Now, this was an American album. This was not a British creation. In Great Britain, this was a double EP. It was 2 45s, and I've got another post up about that, which I've linked below. It was 2 45s in a sleeve that was just this section, 7-inch by 7-inch, and it came with a booklet. It was the 6 songs from the TV movie The Magical Mystery Tour, which the group released in late '67 in England, which did not go over well. In America, they said EPs don't work, so double EP especially, we're going to make a whole album. So they took the 6 songs, which are listed up here from the movie, and then they added 5 songs that had come out in singles in 1967. They kept the book, although it looks a bit grainy because they had to blow it up. But Capitol put that out, and that seemed to go okay. It was nominated for Grammy of the Year, Grammy for Album of the Year, went to #1 for several weeks. It was a huge seller, and it included, what would that be? Hello Goodbye, Strawberry Fields. All you need is, it included 3 #1 hits. And of all the Beatles albums that are excerpted on the Red and Blue albums, the hit albums, 62 to 66, 67 to 70, the highest percentage of songs from an album comes from this, I believe, because there's Magical Mystery Tours on there, Fool on the Hill, so I Am the Walrus might be on there. So this package, this American package, for once, they got it right. And one thing I like that they did in this box set, not only did they retain the book, and this is much harder cardboard than the original, but they also retained the original Capitol label. That's the only one in there. So this is, unlike the other American albums, this has become part of the Beatles canon. Only thing that I noticed about this that was a little bit odd is that compared to an American copy, it's cropped very differently. This is an original American copy. Well, this is an Apple one, so it's probably from '69 instead of '67. But they cropped this here very differently. Notice all that? Just a little bit. And this seems a little bit more bright yellow. Never didn't notice that till now. So that is what's happening with Magical Mystery Tour. Next up is the very celebrated White Album. This in mono, this was the first album by the Beatles that was released in mono in England, but not in America in mono. Americans only got stereo copies of this. Britain got the mono and the stereo for a brief period. Then the mono phased out, and ever since then the mono has been very expensive and difficult to find. Differences between this and the American copies are they both fold open, but American copies were side loaders, is what it's called, like most gatefold albums. In England, first pressings were through the top. I like that they retained that for this box set. I like that they gave you the original poster. Here's the poster right here. I've got my copy framed for my original American pressings. You get that. You also get the original photographs, which look about like this. There's those. Very awesome photographs. Those come with it as well. They retained that. And they retained even this little touch here of the black inner sleeve that does not have a die cut on both sides. That's unusual, and that was a design choice by the Beatles, and they retained that for this set. So this is beautifully done. It sounds excellent. The mixes are, some of them are quite different from the stereo version. And this is the other one probably that I would say it might not be a bad idea to pick up a stereo copy. I don't know that I would pick up a stereo copy from the 2012 batch, which is what Sgt. Pepper was from, which we just saw. But if you can find a good stereo copy out there, not an American one, those sound pretty weak, I would recommend that. Original stereo copies in America sound weak. There are stereo copies of this in America that sound pretty good. They're on a purple label, which came out in the early 80s, I believe. That's recommended. Those sound quite good. So that's the end of the line in this set for original albums. The only other thing that's included is this, Mono Masters. Now, Mono Masters is their way of saying past masters, if you've seen that. When the catalog was redone in 1987 for CD, they included 2 CDs called Past Masters, one that was black with white print and one that was like this, white with black print, that covered all the stray tracks that the band, that wasn't on the band's albums. They released 22 singles in England, and about half of the tracks on those were not on albums. They had the Long Tall Sally EP, which we mentioned earlier. That's not on albums. They had a song called Bad Boy, which was a cover which only came out on a compilation in England. That's not on an album. Across the Universe, so on and on. So what this does, it attempts to collect all those as well, but they've called it Mono Masters because it's slightly different. And this I actually haven't opened yet, but it's got, looks like a good amount of information. There's 3 discs in here. And this starts with the original single version of Love Me Do, different from what's on Please Please Me. And it goes all the way through their career, almost, to You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. Tracks that have never been released in stereo by the Beatles. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, which was recorded sporadically starting in the Sgt. Pepper sections and finally came out as the B-side in 1970 of Let It Be. That's one. The Love Me Do, both the single and the album version, which there's a whole, you can read about that, where they flip-flopped which one was on the single. Those have never been out in real stereo because the tape's long gone. P.S. I Love You, the B-side of that, has never been released in true stereo. And She Loves You, I'll Get You, never been released in true stereo because they tossed the tape out. Somehow, the tape for From Me to You, Thank You Girl was mixed for stereo, so I'm not sure how that anomaly occurred. But that's the songs that have never been released in stereo by the Beatles. You Know My Name, Look Up the Number, by the way. There's a differently edited version of that in stereo on Anthology 2 or 3. So if you wanted to, you could edit the 2 sets together and it wouldn't be true stereo all the way through, but you'd have all the parts of the song. Anyhow, getting back to this album. This includes all those singles tracks I mentioned and stray cuts, and then it's got the 4 songs in mono that were on this album, Yellow Submarine. This came out early '69, a few weeks after the White Album, even though the movie of Yellow Submarine had been out since July of '68, summer of '68. And a lot of people blame Brian Epstein. The Beatles didn't like that he had made the deal for it. They weren't enamored of the movie at first, but eventually came to like it. And a lot of people say if Brian Epstein hadn't died, he died in '67, this would have come out on time and it would have been a better package. Would have come out with the movie instead of 6 months later. So while the White Album was at number 1, this got stuck at number 2. And this is not really a real album. It's got Yellow Submarine, which is on Revolver. It's got All You Need Is Love, which in America was on Magical Mystery Tour. In England, it hadn't been on an album yet. And then it's got 4 songs, only a Northern song, All Together Now, Hey Bulldog, It's All Too Much. That's side 1. Those 4 songs, this is the only other place to get them. Side 2 is all George Martin's score, and I guess he was very adamant that he get to do that because it was a lot of royalties, as you can imagine. And the score is nice, but it's not essential. Nobody liked paying for a whole album just to get 4 new songs. And so what the Beatles did, they were like, you know what, that's a good point. So a couple months later, they mixed these 4 songs for mono, and then they were going to add on Across the Universe, which hadn't been released yet, and make an EP. And that plan fell through. They decided not to do it, but those mixes were uncovered, and they put them on here, finally, for the Mono Masters, so they didn't have to include a whole other album like this. This is one of the reasons this set was much better done than the Rolling Stones one, because in the Stones set, there's 3 discs, 3 whole albums, that have like 1 or 2 or none, no tracks. that are available elsewhere. So they wasted 3 pieces of vinyl in there. Here, they were smart. They just put them on one side of a disc and they were done with it. So this collects together everything. There's 3 songs that were never released in mono that aren't on here. Let It Be, the single version, which is the A-side of You Know My Name, Look Up the Number. That was their last single in England. And The Ballad of John and Yoko and Old Brown Shoe. That was released as a single in mid-'69, right after Get Back. And that was never mixed for mono. So those 3 songs are not on here. They're on Past Masters, but they're not on here. And then Past Masters doesn't include the Yellow Submarine songs. They want you to get the whole album. So it's a trade-off. I like this better, and I'll explain later why that is. So this collects together almost everything. All that's left is the 3 songs I just mentioned from singles, the Abbey Road album, and the Let It Be album. So we're going to get to those in a moment. Getting back to this disc, this is not included in here, but just for completeness sake, in England, the cover was the same, but they wrote Nothing Is Real under there, which is not only a line from Strawberry Fields, but it was apparently their dig at the fact that they didn't even do their own voices. So that's cute. And on the back, in England, instead of having all this, there was a review of the White Album, which I always found strange, which had just come out. A positive review, obviously. In America, they put this nice animated type story about Yellow Submarine and the movie and the crazy made-up history of this whole thing. So I always thought that was a nice touch and a nice reason to get the American album, which is weirdly very difficult to find in the used bins. I don't know why. I'm sure online it's very cheap, but it might be worth grabbing just for that. So, now that we've been over everything that's in this box, let's go over everything that's not in this box. The official Beatles canon contains the 13 albums that they released, Please Please Me, through Let It Be, and then all the songs that are on Past Masters, or in this case, Mono Masters. That's the official canon. So this box gives you essentially 10 of those LPs plus the 4 new songs off of the 11th LP. So that means there's 2 LPs missing. And then there's 3 songs missing, which we mentioned earlier. All of those are on here, on the 67 to 70 collection. You get Ballad of John and Yoko, Old Brown Shoe, which was their, what would that be, 1, 2, third to last single. That's on here. That was only ever mixed for stereo, so it's not in the mono box. And then the A-side to their last single, this is all in Britain, that's the sequence they go with, which was Let It Be. That's a different version than what's on the album, and that is on here as well. So if you ever find one of these, maybe a beat-up copy where disc 1 is missing, all 3 of those songs are on disc 2. In fact, all 3 of those songs may be on side 2 of disc 2. Let's find out. Nope, I was wrong. Ballad of John and Yoko, Old Brown Shoe, end of side 1. And Let It Be right there on side 2. This is disc 2, so sides 3 and 4 essentially is where you will find all of that. Old Brown Shoe and Ballad of John and Yoko are also on the Hey Jude album, which came out in early 70. That's tougher to find. That didn't sell as well as 67 to 70, but those are on there as well. And for those of you who are extra confused, in the US, the last Beatles single was not Let It Be, but they released one more after that, which was The Long and Winding Road. And they both went to #1. But in England, that's not considered part of the official sequence. And Long and Winding Road, of course, is on the Let It Be album. So 3 songs are missing from this, as well as 2 albums. The first is, of course, Abbey Road. This is a late 70s, as you can see from this. That means it's from Mobile Fidelity. They did half-speed mastering. They used Virgin Vinyl. It was one of the first audiophile pressing labels. And this actually sounds quite good. It sounds at least as good, from what I've been able to surmise, at least as good as the 2012 reissue of this album. This was only ever released in stereo in US and in England. Some countries like Paraguay, you know, they might have had a mono version that was just a fold down, where they just combined the 2 channels into one. That's not a true mono mix, and that's why it's not in here, and it's not in the US or UK. But this was only ever released in stereo, and this version from Mobile Fidelity sounds at least as good as the 2012 reissue, as I mentioned. But original British copies of this are not that tough to find. This was a huge selling album. And American copies, they don't sound great, but they don't sound horrendous. Probably not as big a drop from a British to American for Abbey Road as there is for a lot of the other Beatles albums. So if you decide that you want to get this one to add to this set, which you should, it's one of their best albums, you have a pretty good shot, whether you're buying an American, a British, or this one. And these are actually, they've come down a lot in price with all the reissues and everything in the age of eBay. Back in the day, this was quite expensive. In fact, I've still got, you can see my check back here. I'm going to cover my numbers. I paid $30.55 for this back when I bought it. That's a lot of money, especially back then. But they were, Mold Fidelity was very sought after back then. Now you could probably get one of these for probably 20, I'm guessing. And it does sound quite good. I'm pretty happy with the sound, so I've kept this. Original pressings of this, as long as we got this out, I might as well show you. They had a few anomalies. Very early British pressings had sort of a little bit more of a greenish tint to the cover. Also down here, there's some American copies. I think American, maybe British, but American for sure. That it's cropped differently. The photo's cropped differently, and you can see a manhole cover. That you can see the end of the foot crossing, and then a manhole cover below that. So that's pretty interesting. Another clue to the Paul is dead rumor is on here. Several. 28 if, meaning they're saying he would have been 28 if he had lived and not been killed in 1966. In fact, he would have been 27, but they said, oh, we're counting because I think Tibetan culture gives you an extra year for time spent in the womb. So that was the cheat on that. And then this is all pretty well known. They claimed that the way they were dressed was pastor, undertaker, corpse, gravedigger, based on their outfits. And Paul's out of step with the others, so that means he must be dead. And he's holding a cigarette in his right hand, which means that he's probably an imposter because Paul's left-handed. So those are some more clues for the Paul is dead. Another one that most people usually only sometimes mention, if you turn this on its side, looks like a skull, doesn't it? Pretty creepy. Anyhow, original pressings of this, a lot of, like this one goes with the original pressing. It does not list Her Majesty at the end. And the Apple logo, which isn't on this one, it was taken off for copyright reasons in the late 70s. The Apple logo is misaligned on original British copies. Original British copies of this also had the same black inner sleeve with only one side die cut, the way the White Album did. After that, they went to a white inner sleeve. So those are some of the interesting things on Abbey Road. Sometimes they list Her Majesty here, but they do list it on they don't list it on the label, or they won't list it here and they do list it. I don't know. They never could make up their mind with that one, I guess. And Mark Lewison's book has an excellent encapsulation of why Her Majesty is stuck to the end of the album in such a weird fashion, with the last note sliced off and the crashing chord at the middle. Once you read it, you'll think, oh my gosh, makes perfect sense. It's so interesting. Very happy mistake. The other album missing from the Beatles in mono is, of course, Let It Be, the very last album, actually recorded before Abbey Road. And this is a British copy that I got, and I'll show you more of this in a second. Original copies came with this, an advertisement for the film, telling you that you got a 56-page full-color glossy book in the box. This is all in Britain, and please do not open packages. This is a copy, of course, and it came as part of sort of a lavish set. And in Britain, this is the back cover. Looks pretty good. There's also the disc itself. In Britain had a green apple. In America, they had a red apple. And later British ones had a red apple. So that's a bit of a difference for that. But these originally came in England in a boxed set. And that's what I had hiding in here earlier, because it's very fragile. Mine's kind of beat up. Like that. And there's a whole explanation online about different countries have this tinted slightly different. I think Germany, Canada, Great Britain, Japan, maybe New Zealand, Australia are the biggies from where you tend to find these for sale today. It's laminated. It was not the sturdiest thing in the world. This outer sleeve is in pretty decent shape, but inside there was a tray to hold the book, and you can see the trays falling apart. Somebody online sells replacement trays. I should get one. And they also sell the poster, which advertised a bunch of Apple releases that I don't even have. But this tray was inside, and the book that I just showed you would go there, and the disc would go on top of it. And the book is this, and it contains pictures and dialogue from the film, quotes. So maybe it doesn't contain dialogue. I thought it. Oh, it does contain dialogue. There was some. Yeah, where's the dialogue? Right there. There's some. So some of the pages of mine are coming out, and that's a very common thing. Also on the spine here, it says that there's very good reproductions of this, that I think some of them don't have this, or they do. I'll put a link below so you can find out more about all the different versions of the sets. The link, unfortunately, is about 15 years out of date. So it says you can get these for $200 online. That is not the case. They go for quite a bit more. The sound quality of this, though, the British copy that I have, is excellent, especially because the copy I had before this, which I can't show you because I've since gotten rid of it, I had an American pressing that, again, belonged to my father, of this album. And the tinting was slightly different, and it was a gatefold. Inside was a series of photos from the book that I showed you a minute ago. And they didn't reproduce that, I don't think, on the 2012 reissues, because they're going with the British method of doing things. But our copy was pretty much identical, other than what I just mentioned, the gatefold, to the British. You'll notice a red apple on the back. I was always told they put a red one because it was like, this is the end. Stop. Red for stop. But the other thing about the American copy that we had that was different, it had a cut corner here, and the disc had a red label, as I mentioned, and also in the run-out groove, it did not say Bell Sound. Now, here's the thing. This was distributed in America by United Artists, who had the rights to the film, as they did to the other Beatles films. United Artists, when they distributed it, somehow Alan Klein, who, as you can read all about him, it was Beatles manager, apparently did something, and there was millions of copies of this pressed in the US that were counterfeits. We had a counterfeit without even realizing it, but once I listened to it, I knew it was a counterfeit when it's on a good system when I was older. And I figured out it was a counterfeit because it didn't sound so good. The uncut, or the cut side of the apple had the red sort of bleeding into it. The label itself had this odd texture on the ring, and as I said, it didn't say Bell Sound in the run-out groove. And Bell Sound is the company did most of the Beatles LPs and related Apple LPs in the late 70s, late 60s. I'm getting ahead of myself. So if it doesn't say Bell Sound in the run-out groove, it's a fake. And that's pretty much true for any Beatles album, as I'm going to show you in a second. It also, originals had Phil and Ronnie scratched into the run-out groove, and that was for Phil Spector and Ronnie Spector. That was his wife from the Ronettes, and he produced this album, of course. The counterfeits didn't have one or both of those things. Ours didn't say Bell Sound, so I knew it was a fake, and I listened to it, and the cut corner told me that immediately. So that's something to look out for. When you go to buy a copy of Let It Be that's American and you think this sounds horrendous, that's the reason why. So that's it for official releases that are not in here that you would have bought in the store. There are, of course, many, many bootlegs, but there's also a couple LPs that were never released, that were officially released, that are not included in here, and I think rightfully so. When you buy this, you want the best music. You don't want some crazy, extra discs that you have to pay for no good reason. So, in '64, Capitol put this out. This is essentially, well, it says a narrative and musical biography of Beatlemania on 2 long-playing LPs. And that's exactly what it is, and it's interesting for the time, but it's not really essential. And I don't know why anyone would really want that. This is the only Beatles album, by the way, not to go to number 1 or number 2 in the US, but because it's not music. In fact, there's very little music on there, and what little there is, there's a 45-second snippet from their concert at the Hollywood Bowl, which I'll get to in a moment. Vee-Jay, meanwhile, remember Vee-Jay Records in Chicago? They thought, we got to get our own Beatles album, our own product that Capitol has nothing to do with. So they made this whole album by themselves, from scratch, and they still own it and would own it, and they can put it out and do whatever they like with it. They put this out here, the Beatles Tell All. And this is just interviews. This isn't even as nearly as produced as this. And in between songs, percussion by Hal Blaine. That explains it. I was going to say there's someone playing drums as a bridge between the interview sections. Very odd. I bought this at a shop called The Shop, S-H-O-P-P-E, in Berea, Ohio, probably in 1992. And they had a lot of cool stuff. I didn't really look through it too much. And I went back there a couple of years ago, and it's mostly become now sort of a head shop. They have tattoo stuff, smokeless tobacco, vapeware, all those things. But they also have a little bit of vinyl, not very good stuff, in like a dollar bin type thing. And then they had a big bin of new old stock record needles. It got me very excited to look through it, and there were nothing special in there. But what an odd thing to do. I can tell you when I bought it. August 16th, 1992, for $6.80. I don't know if you can read that. Ignore this. This is just the sleeve that I took off of a different disc. So, So those are two things that are not in this box or anywhere. And in fact, here the Beatles Tell All, I don't think has ever been released on CD. This, they were going to put it out on DAT, digital audio tape, in the mid-90s, and they decided not to. I don't know why they would pick this. The article I read on this, I think in retrospect, they probably just had run off a copy of this on DAT as a test to check something out. They weren't really going to release it commercially on digital audio tape, which was it was a format that didn't have a long life, either professionally or in the marketplace, maybe 5, 6, 7 years tops. But that was the only time they even attempted to re-release this. So this went out of print, I think, in the early 70s, and it just came back into print in 2014 for the Beatles' 50th anniversary. Capital EMI finally figured it out and decided they would do something with it. But remember, the Beatles Story has that snippet from the concert at the Hollywood Bowl. Well, there's another album officially released, but not included in any of these sets. This came out in 1977. It was recorded in 1964 and 65. They recorded one show in 64, two in 65. The first show from 65 was pretty much unusable for technical reasons, but a lot of the 64 show and the 65 show melded them together into one concert. And the funny thing is, the tickets here for the first 64 show, August 23rd, and the first 65 show, August 29th, but they never used that show. They used August 30th. Very strange. There's a whole history to this on how it was difficult to put together and whatnot. It's not a bad album. It's interesting. It went to #1 in the UK, #2 in the US. There's some odd anomalies to the 8-track version of this that make it worth a lot of money. And one song that didn't make it onto here was Babies in Black. They finally released that in 1995 on the CD single for Free as a Bird from the Anthology. So for a long time, though, this album, it was available on cassette, on 8-track tape, on vinyl, but not on CD until 2016. Ron Howard's got his new documentary, and they re-released this on CD with Babies in Black and I think 3 other bonus tracks. And they were able to clean up the sound a lot because this was recorded in 3-track stereo, a very odd, short-lived format in the early 60s. The whole reason this wasn't released at the time in the early 60s, they recorded it in 64 thinking we'll put it out. Americans will buy anything Beatles. They'd love to have a live album. And they didn't, in fact, plan to release it in England. They didn't think there'd be interest. But the tapes didn't sound so good to them, so they said forget it. They tried to get in 65, tapes didn't sound so good, they said forget it. Sometime in the early 70s, a copy of one of these shows was run off and made its way out into the bootleg world and was out there for a long time. And eventually in 77, they decided they'd release their own because, and I don't have it here because I don't know why you'd want it, there was another album about to come out that they had no control over called Live at the Star Club, Hamburg, Germany, 1962. In late 62, like December of 62, they were playing in Hamburg, where they played many times in the early years, and a friend of theirs from another group recorded them with just a cheap tape recorder and one mic. Sound quality was pretty bad, but he recorded them, I think, just to test his recorder out, and he recorded it possibly more than one show, but most people at the time thought it was just the New Year's Eve show, December 31st of 62. And then he didn't do much with the tape, and it sat at his house. Somehow it made its way to the Beatles' original manager, Alan Williams, supposedly, and then he went back to retrieve it from his old office, which was abandoned somewhere in Liverpool. It was in a file cabinet. Somehow the tapes made it to a company called Lingasong, which I think was part of Polydor Records, and they cleaned it up, and they were going to put out a double LP set. The Beatles sued them. Didn't work at the time. Eventually, about 15 years later, they got the rights to the tapes and said we never gave permission, and they took the album off the market. But in 77, when that was coming out, they quickly countered it with this, which was good, since, as I said, this topped the charts, whereas the other album didn't do so well. And the other album's been reissued in many different formats. You'll see weird albums with titles like History of the Beatles, the early tapes of the Beatles, things like that. And they're all just based on the Hamburg tapes, which are pretty poor. I'm sure if they were recorded better, it would have been interesting, because the playing's not bad, but it sounds like you're in another room. You're in one room and the band is in another. So that's pretty much it for official releases from back then that were not included. There's, of course, the 3 anthology sets. There's also Let It Be Naked. This came out in 03 and is a reimagining of the Let It Be album without a lot of Phil Spector's production touches. That's not a bad album. That and the original Let It Be both have its merits, so I can't really say definitively that you want one and don't want the other. And then there's this. In 1978, EMI put out a set of the Beatles, the 12 albums, not Magical Mystery Tour, but the other 12, in a box set. And then they decided, you know what? A lot of people have the red and blue hits albums, 67 to 70, 62 to 66. Why don't we put together another disc that has just B-sides and things that aren't on any of these, and they're not in the original albums. So they did that. They made an album called Rarities. In America, then, that album, when it got released, shortly thereafter, everyone said, most of these songs are on the American albums. We don't need this. So Capitol Records put together its own version of Rarities, and they released it in 1980. This set, there's many things with it that probably could have been done differently. Number one, I've seen this described as a small photo of the Beatles looking bored, and that's pretty much what it is. They probably could have come up with a bit of a better cover. On the back here, they have a lot of good info, although in Helter Skelter they identify, I've got blisters on my fingers, as being by John Lennon. And of course Ringo is the one who actually said that. But the inner sleeve is quite nice. I like that, with a lot of great photos on it. And inside of this, you get the original Butcher cover, unadorned with any text or anything. So I'm sure there's a lot of bootleggers who scanned that and used that for various things over the years. This side's not so bad either. Now that I'm looking at it, though, I notice, first of all, that's the photo from yesterday and today. If you can see that they cropped out the background and they used that. On 8-track tapes, though, and cassettes, I've seen this actual photo without the background cropped. And I'm also looking at this, and I notice most of these photos are from 64 to 66, except that one. There's no photos from after that, so that's interesting. But the reason I'm showing this is not just because it's an interesting package. There's been a lot of interesting packages by the Beatles over the years. There's 20 Greatest Hits. There's, the Red and the Blue albums we mentioned, rock and roll music. There's one called the Beatles Ballads, which only came out, I think, in Australia and other parts of the world. And the cover of that is based on the Ibsen painting A Doll's House, which was the original title of the White Album, and that was the painting they wanted to use. Of course, none of that happened, but it would have been interesting if they had done that. Another ornate cover like Sgt. Pepper. It's a great image. But getting back to this collected together a bunch of songs that at the time were not really on any Capitol albums. So you've got B-sides, You Know My Name, look up the number, The Inner Light, where's the other one? Sleep Dick, the German She Loves You. Love Me Do, the original single version. Misery and There's a Place. Remember, these got kicked off of Please Please Me when it became the early Beatles here. And there's also a few songs like I'm Only Sleeping. This is one of those alternate mixes that I mentioned. Help. This is the mono mix that's different from what we've got. The mono mixes of Don't Pass Me By and Helter Skelter, which are quite different. Across the Universe, which was given to a charity album, so it was tough to find when this came out in 1980. And then the Sgt. Pepper Inner Groove. Sgt. Pepper, at the end of side 2, as most people probably know, there's a high-pitched tone for dogs to hear, and then the inner groove, where your needle will just go round and round until you pick it up. They put in a little message, and they recreated it here because American copies didn't have that, or the high-pitched tone, because it's very difficult to cut. In fact, when they were doing the disc cutting in England of the first pressings of Sgt. Pepper, they had to do it twice because they couldn't get it quite right to get that into the inner groove. It was quite a challenge. You can read about how they created the inner groove in the Lewison book, and if you play it backwards, it sounds like they're saying something really off color. I'll leave that to all of you detectives to figure out. But the inner groove is quite an interesting piece of Beatle history. They recorded some gibberish. I'll just tell you. They recorded some gibberish, went up to the studio, to the control room, cut the tape into pieces, threw the pieces up in the air, taped them back together in random order, and it still sounded pretty normal. So then I think they did it again, and then the second time it sounded gibberishy enough that they could put it in and nonsensical. So we've covered most of the songs on here, but the reason I brought this up for things that aren't included, there's a few pieces that are not found anywhere else. This is the original single mix of Penny Lane on here, and it's got an extra little bit of the piccolo trumpet at the end. If you listen to the version on Anthology 2, which is the best parts of several takes put together to make one alternate, it's on there, but to hear it on the original recording at the end, it's very weird. That went out on promo copies, and then they quickly pulled them back and re-released it. So that's one difference. One piece that's on here that's not really available anywhere else. This version of I Am the Walrus They took a UK mix, I think the UK stereo mix and the US mono single mix, perhaps, and combined them. They don't really explain it real well here. And there's extra beats in here. At the beginning, there's a few extra beats. So that composite has never been reissued. Same with this And I Love Her. This is from the German version of Something New. And it's got the last guitar figure repeated 6 times instead of 4. The double tracking on Paul's voice is also a little bit different. So those are 3 things that are only on, well, they are elsewhere probably, some of them. But this is the best place to find all 3 of them. This album is not that expensive. It's not that tough to find. And it made it to number 21 on the charts when it came out in 1980. So those are some of the official releases that didn't come out. I forgot to mention, for Rarities, there's this. This came out about a year before the American Rarities. This is a bootleg. This is not official. It's a really well done bootleg. And if you read Clinton Halen's book about the bootleg industry, he talks about the guy behind this. And that guy made only maybe 3, 4, 5 bootlegs in his career, but they were all really well done, packaging and sound. And this has almost exactly the same contents of the later Rarities album. In fact, it has a few more songs. So he's included a single version of I'm the Walrus. He's got the true stereo version of Baby You're a Rich Man, which had only come out in Germany. This didn't get a true stereo mix because it was a B-side until 1971, I believe. And it's got Thank You Girl, which had never been on a Capitol album before. So this is almost a better buy. The sound quality is not quite as good, of course, but he made it to look just like a real Capitol album, which is pretty ingenious. The label doesn't tell you too much, except which side you're on. But this is a really well done package, and not that, well, probably difficult to find now, but when I bought it, I feel like this was only $9 or $10. But this was the Persky order Rarities. I'm sure someone at Capitol got wind of this and said, let's just do that. So that's it for official releases you could buy in stores. There's one more that was officially released, the Beatles Christmas Album. First of all, this does not look that Christmassy, either the photographs chosen or the design motif. Nevertheless, this came out in 1970. In England, it came out in March of 71 with a different cover that looked a lot like the 1963 Christmas disc. And to explain what this is, every year at Christmas time, the Beatles would send out a flexi disc to their fan club saying Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. You know, they'd sing crazy songs, maybe they'd talk about the previous year. That was in 63, 64, 65, and 66. In 67, they did a lot of production. They recorded a song, Christmas Time Is Here Again, and they made it sound like a little vaudeville talent show. And then in 68 and 69, each Beatle recorded a contribution separately, and then Kenny Everett, who was a DJ and a good friend of theirs, he edited that all together. And the whole presentation would be about 7 minutes each time, and they'd put it on a flexi disc and they'd mail it out to the band's fan club. Well, that was 63 to 69. In 70, there was not going to be any sort of message or anything. Beatles were over. But the fan club put them all together on this, allegedly using the clean flexi disc copies that their secretary had kept, because the tapes were long gone. A lot of times the tapes weren't even done at EMI. They would record it at their publisher's place, or, you know, in the later years, Kenny Everett would be putting it together from tapes he got from their homes. So the sound quality of this was not great. It was never going to be great, but it's very much passable. And this was given to the fan club in December of 70. So, in America. And like I said, March of 71 for England. And there's the covers, 63, 64, 65, 66, 67. Oh, wait a minute. This is the American version. They're only showing 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69. These were what they released in America. We never got one in 63 because the Beatles weren't famous here yet. And in fact, the 1964 American one was an edited version of the 1963 British one. And then in 65, we didn't even get one, or so it says. In 66, I think we got the 65. It's a whole thing. It was all off. But the contents are the original 7 from England that were done every year. So this has got everything on it. One thing to keep in mind, that the 1967 disc, which Christmas Time Is Here Again, you can find the entire song unedited on the singles, the Real Love single that was released in the mid-90s as part of Anthology. That's on there, unedited, a version of that song. It's catchy, a little repetitive, but it's catchy. And the 63 Christmas Message. There's an edited version of that, or there was, that you could download as part of Beatles Rock Band. Other than that, none of this has been officially released ever. Some bootleggers have tried, and in fact there's many, many counterfeits of this album, but the originals go for quite a bit of money. And I've heard all sorts of different ways that you can tell an original versus a copy. For example, this photo here, apparently, if you can read what's on that little marquee up above, it's supposed to say Theatre Royale. If you can read that, that means that you've got an original. Or maybe it's right there. I can't tell. But that tells you it's an original. This photo, I guess, if there's a dark spot over his eye, or maybe it's this photo, I can't tell, that means it's a fake. So I've never been sure. Some of them, the cardstock isn't so good. But this one, to me, looked like it was an original when I bought it, based on what I knew then. Fortunately, I paid a good price for it. I didn't pay too much. But then also, when you look at the label, it doesn't look at all like it might be a fake. And in fact, this here, if you can see, there's an indent. This is raised, the outer part. And there's an indent. That being there, it's supposedly a sign that this is an original. Another sign, and see, there's no bleeding through on the uncut. Another sign is, it says Bell Sound. I don't know if you can see that. If you remember earlier, I was mentioning Bell Sound as far as Let It Be. Well, this one says Bell Sound. It's got the logo that tells me it's a Capitol plant. So this, I'm pretty sure, is an original. Someone should leave a comment if there's other things I can do to check. But I'm pretty sure this is an original. And in fact, as long as we've got this out, when it comes to Let It Be, I might as well show you some of the things I was talking about. This here had this odd, uneven texture on it, this rim, on the Let It Be that we had that was clearly a counterfeit. And it didn't have the Bell Sound that I mentioned. And here, the colors were bleeding onto the white. So that was how I knew that Let It Be was a fake. But as far as this album, it's enjoyable. It's fun to listen to maybe once or twice. And it's very valuable now if you can find one. Even the counterfeits are getting up there in price, and the repressings and the reproductions. But that's another official one that's gotten zero re-release, except for the song and the download from Rock Band that I mentioned. So that's it, as far as I know, for official releases. There's, of course, bootlegs and everything out there. And while I don't condone those, and I certainly can't get into them because we'll be here till the end of time, there's thousands of Beatles bootlegs. There is one set that I have obtained over the years that gathered together pretty much the best of the bootleg stuff. And that's this. The Beatles from the Vault. I've been able to find very little information about this. It's from the early 80s. And if you're familiar with it, I was going to mention this earlier. If you see how it flips open like that, this design is based on a set of box sets that came out in the late 70s in England and other parts of Europe and Japan and everything, and they were available here, of course. They collected all the Beatles albums together. There was a blue one that had all the stereo albums. That was the one that had Rarities that I mentioned. There was a red one that had just the mono albums. It didn't have Rarities, I don't think. It didn't have any other collections with it. It was just their mono albums in a red box just like this. And that's a much cheaper, for many years, that was a much cheaper way to get them all in mono until this came along. This has sort of superseded that. Some people will argue maybe that red box sounds better, but I think this new one is excellently done. But back to this Beatles from the Vault. So it opened like that. I'm trying to be really careful, keep it in good shape. And whoops, I'm not being careful. Oh, it doesn't open that way, does it? How the heck does it open? It opens like this. And that's, oh, it opens like this and then this flips out. I don't actually think that's correct. Guess I'll find out later. But this has got, okay, so there's file, this is volume 2. Volume 1 I don't have in the box, it's over on the shelf. But they come with these reproduction sheets from Abbey Road, to make a look at it from Abbey Road. And in this case, this just has several excellent outtakes, some of the best outtakes that were out there. For example, the song Not Guilty from the White Album sessions, the acoustic version of While My Guitar Gently Weeps, The Inner Light, which was just difficult to find back then because it was a B-side. It's got the original version of I'm Looking Through You, and most, if not all of these, are on the Anthology series and in much better sound quality. But it's fun to have this, I think. The sound is actually pretty good, and if you'll notice here, it's on colored vinyl. Each one's on a different type of colored vinyl. And that trademark of quality, TMQ, that was one of the premier bootleg labels. So there's that. There is Decca tapes. This was the one I was going to mention earlier. I almost did. January 1st, 1962, the Beatles, with Pete Best instead of Ringo, auditioned for Decca Records. They recorded, I think, 15 songs, 12 covers, and 3 originals. And 5 of those tunes are on the Anthology, Anthology 1. But the other 10 have not been reissued. And they're all collected on here. There's a lot of bootlegs that collect all these together. So it's nice to have them all in one spot. It's a studio quality recording, sounds excellent, and it's pretty good performances. Not great. They were hungover from New Year's Eve, and they had Pete Best. They didn't have the manic good humor of Ringo yet. But hearing this, you think, A, why did Decca turn them down? Maybe they seem kind of low energy. But B, you're like, this is not that bad. It's enjoyable. It's basically a whole Beatles album that's just lost to time, sort of an embryonic Please Please Me. And looking at the list of songs, not a single one of these was recorded by the group officially, except for Till There Was You from the Music Man and Money. And that was on their second album with the Beatles. This one again is on colored vinyl. Let's see, purple this time. Very good. There's also a cool set of these songs were reissued on a set of singles on what was called the Decca Gone label. I think that was in the mid-'70s. They had cool picture sleeves, like the Capitol one, same motif. And those are very expensive and hard to find. Not hard to find, but they're expensive. So that's another cool way to get it. This one also has a version of the Christmas album called the Complete Christmas Collection. And please tell me it's on green vinyl. No, it's on purple. Come on, fellas, green or red? Oh, well. There's that. Oh, I finally laminated these. That was smart. Another one of studio outtakes has got Come and Get It. Paul's nice demo that he gave to Badfinger. Goodbye, nice demo that it's acoustic, he gave to Mary Hopkin. I Me Mine, George's demo of that. Shake, Rattle, and Roll from the Let It Be sessions. And Leave My Kitten Alone. And this one's on red vinyl. Yeah. Should have swapped them. That one and the Christmas one. And there is the Get Back Masters. This is essentially the original version of Get Back, as it was put together by Glyn Johns before Phil Spector was brought in. So it's an interesting way to hear it. It's not unlike Let It Be Naked. And I want to stress again, a lot of this is in the anthology set, but a lot of it, like the Christmas collection and the Decca album, are not. So it's like 2 full Lost Beatles albums that you get in here if you can't find the money to buy one of these or to buy the very expensive Decca singles. And then this is broadcast, sort of a live at the BBC, and sort of the best of the live at the BBC. And I don't believe it includes I'll Be On My Way, which is the one Lennon-McCartney song that they performed on the BBC, which has never turned up on one of their own albums. Maybe it's on one of the other discs in this set, I'm not sure. This set also included, you can see this t-shirt, which I'm not going to attempt to touch. There's also a booklet, which I think is hidden back here. It's a small booklet, mimeographed, but nonetheless, that's in there. The last thing that's included is this. This has got a copyright date of 1975. I don't think that's accurate. From Us to You, a Parlophone rehearsal session. Just outtakes, not a rehearsal session, because it's got From Us to You. They recorded that for the BBC specifically as a jingle, but then it's also got A Hard Day's Night, which was done much later. Most of these look like they're from '64. I'm Happy Just to Dance With You as an instrumental, probably the backing track. Long Tall Sally, If I Fell, Boys. So this sort of runs the gamut of early Beatlemania, the first couple of years, as far as studio outtakes, which are tough to find. And it's cool to have a 10-inch Beatles record. You don't see too many of these. So that's just one bootleg set. If you can find this, I recommend it for a decent price. There's at least 2 LPs of great stuff in here, and the discs of outtakes have a lot more going for them than just what's on the anthology. There's a few things that you won't find there. And I was able to find the booklet. It's that. I don't think I've taken it out. And it's got a lot of good info in it on what these things actually are. And this one, this last disc, was not studio outtakes as I thought that was on the shelf. This is actually early mixes of what was on Abbey Road. So it's got the medley. Oh, it's got Carry That Weight, followed by Her Majesty. You can read all about that. So, Lalina, the Unicorn, Heather, a lot of things that were not ever revisited by the Beatles. And let's see, it's also got some film in here from, looks like the Shea Stadium show. They must have taken a copy of the Shea movie and just sliced it up. put a little bit into each one. These bootleggers were very interesting. This one's a bit different, black vinyl, and it does not have a TMQ label, but it's clearly part of the set because it's listed on here. Abbey Road NW8. NW8 was their postal code at Abbey Road. So that's it for everything that you might possibly want by the Beatles to get their canon. I'm not taking a stand either way on the mono versus stereo issue, except to say the mono's better in this case. As I mentioned, maybe you want to get the stereo Sgt. Pepper or maybe the stereo White Album just to experience them. But other than that, you get this set, you get Abbey Road, you get Let It Be, maybe you find those 3 songs. You've got the core. And then if you want, you can grab the Christmas album and the Decca tapes out of this set. Maybe you want to buy the Anthology. You know, here's Anthology 3, if you want to buy that. And there's, of course, 3 volumes of the Anthology. And then if you're interested, Live at the Hollywood Bowl, which was just reissued, Let It Be Naked. If you really want it, you can find the 2 interview albums here, the Beatles Tell All and the Beatles Story. And you could even, if you really wanted to go nuts, track down an original Yellow Submarine to get the songs on side 2 from the George Martin Orchestra. But I cannot believe I forgot to mention, as far as the Beatles canon and things that you might want in a box set, at this point I've named an entire box set's worth of extra stuff that you could add to the Beatles in mono. Well, this is another one. 1994, the Beatles live at the BBC. That's when this album came out. This is my original copy from back then. You can see $23.99, and I believe it was on closeout, so it might have been even less. And oh, and somehow I got a cover slick. From the record store. Imagine that. I got this from a store that's in Tower City, which is a big shopping center in downtown Cleveland, and it's still there. And the record store's still there. I think it's a different company now, because back then it would have been like Camelot or something, which doesn't exist. And they had a big replica 57 Chevy inside for some reason. Now they sell not only new vinyl, but they have used vinyl, which is very weird in a chain store. And they, of course, sell all the other crazy stuff that mall record stores sell. But that's where I bought this one on clearance, because they figured nobody wants vinyl right now. And I got a good deal on it, and I've enjoyed it. I've played it a few times. It's cut at a bit of a low level because I had to really cram a lot of music onto 2 discs. The reissue of this from 2013 is on 3 discs, and they've made a couple tweaks to the track listing. They also released Live at the BBC Volume 2, which I don't have on vinyl, with a whole bunch of other cuts. So those are just 2 discs that you can get to add to your collection for completeness sake. And the other thing that I mentioned, the book that came with the Let It Be box set in England, all the dialogue that's in that is on the back of this poster. This is a poster that came with the 1981 bootleg, the Black Album, which was not the Prince album that you've heard of, but it was 2 LPs of Get Back session outtakes. And it was a really well done bootleg. It was basically the design was inverse of a White Album. And actually I think it was 3 discs. I may have said 2 discs. And it came with this great poster. All of a sudden here in 2016, a big cache of these posters has shown up. So if you go online and play your cards right, you might be able to get one. And you can't see it, of course, but the whole reason I wanted to show it to you was because on the back of this, instead of the lyrics, the way they have on the White Album poster, they've got all the dialogue and text from that Beatles Get Back book that came with the British Let It Be set. So a very obscure, odd thing that all of a sudden is kind of available to us again. I think they did a really nice job on this montage tribute poster to the White Album poster, except right down here, this Paul looks very strange. Anyhow, almost looks like he's Asian. But that's this poster, and that's what's on the back of it. That's just a couple more pieces of the Beatles mystery. So I'd said at the beginning of this, I gave a strong A- to the Rolling Stones set. I give this one a strong A, kept only from an A+ by the fact that they could have just included Abbey Road and Let It Be and those other 3 songs if they wanted, and given you the full official canon. But other than that, it's a great set. I give it a strong A. I highly recommend it. Some of the greatest music ever made in a beautiful and excellent sounding presentation.